Well, welcome to Brainstorming the Human Connection, brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council here in Brookings, South Dakota. We're going to be talking today about families who some of their members have been deployed into various wars, or they go away to a war zone, and what kind of pressures and experiences they have. I want to remind you first, however, that this is an interactive program. That means that we're looking for you to be a part of the program. It isn't just talking heads. We want you to interact. We appreciate your questions, and if you're too shy to talk on the microphone, we do have this thing called a chat down at the bottom. You'll see a little balloon like the cartoons, and it says chat underneath that. If you click in that, you can then type in any questions or comments or something like that, and we will use one of our round tools to bring you into the conversation. Many of us have gone to parades and seen all kinds of banners and things honoring our troops and sending them off to war, and we wave the flags and we do all the pomp and circumstance, and we like to do the thank you for your service, I call them sort of guilt towels, to assuage our guilt about sending young people, and sometimes older people too, off to dubious wars. And one of the things we forget is that war is not only being fought on that battleground, it's being fought in homes of all of those soldiers who are deployed. There are a lot of issues that we're going to be talking about today relative to that. But I think it's very important for us to reflect that it's not just that soldier who is undergoing a lot of stress. There are families, there are wives, there are children, there are parents, there are all kinds of people connected with that soldier whose lives are forever changed by that person being deployed to a war zone. We're going to talk a little about that today. And my guest today is Amber Jensen, who's a lecturer over at South Dakota State University. She's also the author of The Smoke of You, a memoir of love during and after deployment. So welcome, Amber.
Thank you, Lawrence. Nice to be here, and can't wait to talk about, as you said, some important issues. So
right.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start by giving folks a little bit of background of Amber. Who is Amber? Where were you born? Family, where'd you grow up? Just so we kind of get the thumbnail elevator speech of Amber Jensen.
Yes, well, I was actually, I live, the house I'm in right now, the acreage I'm on right now is about 1.5 miles from the farm where I grew up. So I was born in Watertown, South Dakota, and raised here in Bryant, South Dakota, on a dairy farm. And my husband is also from this area. He grew up in Bryant as well. Our families have kind of known each other essentially all our lives. Our grandmothers did things at church together, and our uncles and dads played sports together and things like that. So we're both from South Dakota here. Went to school at Hamlin High School. Both of us did our undergraduate at South Dakota State. And so, yeah, we're really tied to this part of South Dakota.
So you're not really cousins, but close.
No, yeah, we are not blood related, but yeah, we have a lot in common.
But you've done all this kind of things together, just almost like you were.
Yes.
Yeah, good.
When we got married, our pastor
good.
said, "You're not two ships passing in the night. You know a lot about each other and about where you come from." So
that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Mhm. Okay, so tell us about becoming an author. That was your background, and now you're a lecturer. Tell us about how you got into that kind of position. What do you do in that position? And then how did you uh, metamorph into being an author?
So I think both things, being a writer and being a college instructor, are things that somehow I knew I wanted to do, but I didn't exactly know the path of how I would get there. So I'm very grateful for the mentors, the educators, the family who have kind of helped me find my way on this path. Because when I was really young, I come from a family that loves stories, and I loved stories, right? I liked reading stories with my parents. And I told the story at the book launch of, I remember when my brother, who's about 8 years older than me, when I thought he was being mean to me as a kid, I would sit him down and read The Giving Tree to him and be like, okay, there's a lesson here for us. So I've always loved stories and seen the power of stories. And like I said, that's something in both my husband's family and my family. But I had never known a writer. So I didn't ever really think of, you know, that as being my ultimate goal or understanding how I might get there. But similarly, I was always drawn to teaching. Again, I'm reading stories to my older brother in a didactic way, right? Like I kind of loved teaching. But I never knew anyone who was a college instructor, so that hadn't really crossed my mind. So it just kind of, as I followed my passions for language and story and education, I'm very grateful to have ended up where I am now. And like I said, I think that's mostly because of the teachers and mentors that I've had who have encouraged me and recognized potential in my writing or my storytelling and encouraged me to keep pursuing that. And as I did that and pursued my education, realizing that, that could lead me to teaching at the collegiate level, which is where I feel at home, and to get to teach others the art of writing and, the struggle of writing and what we get out of it. So those things kind of emerged slowly over time, and I kind of ended up in a place that I don't think I ever would have pointed to, as even as a high school or even as a college student. I don't think I would have said, here's exactly where I think I'll be. So it's been a kind of a winding process, but I've always enjoyed writing and always felt drawn to writing. When I finally discovered the genre of creative nonfiction and realized it was okay to tell your own story, then I really did start to think, okay, now I do think I can do this, because I was always the one writing very thinly veiled fiction, like I was actually writing about people in my life or experiences that I had, things that were important to me, people that were important to me, but I was giving them other names and, and kind of trying to fictionalize them just enough so that hopefully it wasn't obvious. And so when I realized I didn't have to do that, that it was okay to write about those people and places and experiences that were important to me, that's when writing really started to click. And then I thought, yeah, this is what I want to do. So
I think Dragnet used to say that. It's an old crime movie. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Right. Yes.
So your book is The Smoke of You.
Mm-hmm.
What is that book about? Is it a love story? Is it a war story? What is it about?
It is a story of love, and I think love throughout challenges, right? So when I first started writing it, I thought it was a war story, and the first drafts of this book really covered the 1 year of my husband's deployment and that experience, because I thought that was the big story, right? I thought that was the headline. That's what people would be interested in. But then as I wrote, and I was writing to make sense of those experiences, but as I was writing, life, kept going, and I kept realizing, oh, there's so much more to this story. It's not just that experience of being separated. Once my husband was home and started to see the effects of military experience on him, the way our communication had been affected and all this, I realized, this, even if this is a war story, it's not just a 1 year deployment, right? It's a much longer story than that. And so I felt like it was really significant to share that story with others, because even as I was living it, I didn't understand it, and I think how can we expect our American public and our, even our government officials, and how can we expect people to understand the repercussions of war if we can't share stories like this, right? And how can we help each other if we don't understand what we're all going through, right? So it just felt really important to share this story, because our story is, to be honest, from the outside, it's a happy story. It's a pretty simple story, right? I mean, a lot of people who know Blake and I and have known us all of our lives read this and kind of say, I had no idea, right? From the outside, it looks, you keep it together, you make it through, and we're not always very good at being vulnerable and sharing what we're going through, which I think is understandable. Sometimes we just have to do that. But I think if we aren't willing to share that, then we can't do better for each other in the future, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad that you wrote this book. I think there could be others who have written something similar, but I don't know about it. But I've felt for some time now that it's one of the very important untold stories of military and wars and those kind of things, is all the collateral damage that happens when a person is deployed. So let's get into the story now. It's can you tell us the 50,000-foot view that is without spoilers of what the story is about?
Well, yeah, let me give it a shot. So the story does tell the story of our relationship. My husband and I were married shortly before he was deployed to Iraq. Our son was born while he was in Iraq. And so, like I said, that first year, in the first or year and a half, 2 years of this story are, really that experience of getting married, my husband going to war, us having our first child and being separated. So there's that innate drama, right? Like I said, that's what I thought the story was initially. But then as life went on and I started, as I mentioned, to see how many other effects there are from this experience, I felt it was really important to tell the rest of that story. So, so the book continues on through some of the challenges my husband faced with chronic pain and, back injury from his military experience. And, the addiction to pain medicine, the depression, the physical ailments that come along with all of that, and how, we as a family learn to adapt to that, but also just to support each other and understand each other through that. And so, I think that this book is as much about communication and, commitment through challenges. And so, it kind of goes back to your earlier question, is this a war story or a love story? And I mean, I think in that sense, it is more of a love story, right? I mean, it's just about how we keep working through our challenges. So I guess I have to give the spoiler. I mean, luckily we've made it through these things together, and our family is, settled into this new life, and, our kids are growing up, and our relationship. It's funny how these themes from military experience can continue to come back and return. It's always part of our relationship. But like I said, I think this book is as much about just learning how to hold on to what's important to us and how to support each other as it is about, anything else.
So one of the things that I've wondered about in these kind of relationships is the loneliness and the uncertainty of the spouse who's left behind with the children. Can you give us some kind of insight as to, one, what that feels like to the best that you can? And then two, what are some ways that you cope with that kind of loneliness?
So during Blake's deployment, I kind of our situation was a bit unique in that we were newly married. We were expecting our first child. And so we had a lot of things that we didn't know how to do. We didn't have expectations for each other or for life in those ways. And so in some ways, I feel like maybe that was a blessing in disguise for us, right? I mean, I didn't know how hard it would be to raise a child, without a partner or because we hadn't had that experience before, right? So I didn't have any comparison there. And our son was an infant, so he didn't really necessarily, cognitively understand what he was missing. But there really was for me, a sense of actually resentment when people would, comment on, well, you're, a single mom raising your son on your own. And I was like, my husband's alive, he's just not here, and there was so that struggle between, I always felt a little defensive, right?
Yeah.
I didn't want it to seem like it was a burden in a sense, if that makes sense. So
Yes.
there's this kind of stoicism, right? You kind of you do what you have to get by. And so although that was a big challenge, like I said, we have very close families, and I had so much family support that I never felt like I had to do things on my own. So that was definitely a blessing. And yet the communication is one of those things, just learning how to communicate openly with your spouse about those important things. So there's where maybe the challenge comes in, right? So the pro was we didn't know what it was like to be married. We didn't have expectations for each other as parents or spouses. And yet when you develop your relationship early in our marriage, being, a world apart and having your lives be so different, I think there's some challenges to then finding those connections after, right?
Yes.
So that sense that we were living such different lives and that disconnect, I think, does create that sense of loneliness, right? Of not being able to really understand exactly what your partner is going through.
Well, sometimes, it's useful to reflect on the difference between being alone and loneliness.
Yeah.
Can you share with us how you experience the difference between those two feelings?
That's a good question. Yeah, and I think that I honestly felt and continue to feel, with, like I said, this book being a reminder of holding on to what's important to us. And I think that Blake and I began our marriage with a strong commitment, and in a way that kind of facing this kind of challenge early in your marriage really reinforces your commitment to, what you're doing and why, and how our relationship began with some turmoil, maybe in a way, strengthened our commitment to that, right? To say, so I don't know that I could say that I felt loneliness in that way, right? I never felt like I was on my own, because I think we both knew we were in it together. And, and like I said, we have family histories that we felt very connected. But not having that person to have your conversation with, right? To talk through the difficult things. And so actually I did, and I think I even write about this in the book, but when I would write letters to Blake, I would read them out loud. I would look at a picture of him, and, I was just really trying to keep that connection, which is hard to do when my husband's also not a tech person. So he wasn't good at, video calls or phone calls or that kind of thing. And we knew that, and we could joke about it. But a lot of that intimacy came with the letters that I would write to him, and the brief phone calls that we had, and things like that, and keeping our connection.
Now, one of the things I've come to recognize, I should say, about human connections has to do with kind of what we're doing now. After the coronavirus, suddenly people couldn't get together,
Mm-hmm.
and they were separated physically.
Mm-hmm.
And then people, this technology allowed us to go one step further than the telephone call, which is a step further than the letter,
Yep.
because you can't hear the voice, the inflection, and all of that. But the Zoom call allowed us to at least see some of the expression, but still there was that thing that was missing, that human kind of connection. And sometimes it's as basic as pheromones, when you're with somebody and they're in the same room, even if you don't notice their smell, sometimes that's a good thing. You can actually your nose is picking it up, and there's a certain sense that you have in connection. The little squeeze, in the kitchen, or something like that, or holding hands or something. Those things mean something. Yeah. So I mention those things because I have to think that the absence of those things plays some part in how you're feeling about the total experience. If so, could you reflect on that for us?
Well, actually, I mean, as you were talking and thinking about those connections, I do think, and maybe this is me as a writer, but my husband's also he's a very introverted, thoughtful, intellectual kind of guy as well. And I think for both of us, the step back to the letter writing was almost more intimate than if we had been doing these. They weren't Zoom calls then, but they did have the option to to do some computer. But even a phone call was kind of lagged, and so you'd hear your voice echo, and then you'd be waiting to hear them, and it was always a little awkward. And so for us, I don't know if that's old fashioned or just what it is, or if it's because I'm a writer and I like words, and he always jokes, I knew I married a writer, so maybe he knew what he was getting into. But we had written letters when he was in basic training, when I was in college, and he, after high school, went into basic training, and we wrote letters to each other at that point too. So for us, there was that sense of kind of taking that step back was almost our way of claiming our own space, if that makes sense. There's a scene I wrote about in the book too, when we said goodbye, when he was actually leaving for Iraq, and he parked a long ways away from the armory. And my husband he's a very introverted, like I said, thoughtful person. And he made it make sense to me at the time. To me, it was like, I got to be with you every second until you leave, that idea of I want to hold your hand until I can't hold it anymore. But for him, I really did understand that kind of took away our ability to connect and say our goodbye in our way, right? And so I don't know, I think it can be different all the time. And maybe that's a thing, something as military families, especially those who have long service and, people who are deployed multiple times, this getting used to disconnecting is not always a healthy thing, but in a way, you have to learn how to do it in a healthy way, right? So even in that short time, we had to say several goodbyes and different versions of goodbyes. And so I don't know, it's just a way of learning to stay connected in spite of that physical disconnect that has to happen. There again, I think that's something that I was exploring through the writing of the book, and that was a concern I had from my son. What happens to a father-son relationship when they don't have those same physical connections that babies establish with their parents in that first year? And I think it's like I said earlier, it's something that we continue to see. We're still working on those connections, but I think we all are in our relationships, right?
Yes, so much. So we're going to turn to our esteemed panel here, and Todd has a question, and his question is, what was one of the most surprising revelations that you had in the writing process that you couldn't have had without authoring the book?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think there's a lot, but for me, and again, this is a moment that I think is pretty evident in the book, but in the writing process, I came across a letter that I had started writing and I never finished, because I felt it was a hard emotion to deal with. And so then in the writing process, I actually finished, okay, what was it that I was trying to say? What did I want to say? And it was, really confronting some of those, the hard emotions of, and actually someone else pinned it for me as survivor's guilt, the idea that I'm here living without you and I can go on and life does go on. And, I want you to come back, but I know that you might not. And so that idea of survivor's guilt of being able to move on. And so that was really something that I don't know if or when or how I would have come to that realization if I wasn't writing and, finding that old letter and really kind of giving myself the space, but also forcing myself to confront, why did you stop? What is it that you wanted to say that you were struggling with? And I think, coming to terms with that is really important for coming to terms with how our relationship then evolves once he's home, right? Because I think that's a very common theme for military families or families who are separated for other reasons, right? The family members who are at home living daily life find a way to get by. And then when, a family member returns, there is some friction. How do you find room for that person? It changes the rhythms of the family and the way that you conduct your business. And so I think that was a really important thing for me to be able to name that and acknowledge it so that then I could understand why I was feeling what I was feeling, right? As we negotiated some of those things once Blake had returned.
Mhm. Anyone else have any questions they want to ask? If you do, just unmic yourself or raise your hand or something like that. And we'd love to hear your questions or your comments. Maybe you have a similar experience. Jody?
I want to ask something, but I'm trying to figure out how to say it. Let's see. I think I want to ask, how has it been going revisiting all of this for so long? Because I love your book. I mean, I read it in 3 days, I think. It was very fast. And I'm also caring for small humans. So it was fast for me. And I loved it. I mean, I thought it was just, I love your language. I love all these little moments that were surprising metaphors. It was a gorgeous book. I mean, it's fantastic. But I am wondering how you're dealing with that, because I'm not great at dealing with that. I've written about stuff that I'm I don't really want to revisit that and keep talking about it. So I'm kind of wondering how you manage that, because I'm very impressed by how you're managing it.
Well, thank you for both of that about the book and how this is all going. It is a challenge, I will say. When we did a book tour where we did about, I don't know, 8 events in 10 days or something, I didn't expect necessarily to feel as emotionally kind of drained by that experience as I was. But I can't do the same thing twice. And so I was reading all these different, so I was kind of revisiting the whole story in that, week and a half, by reading different excerpts and thinking about different things. But I do think that it really deepens the understanding as well that I kind of came to, because I really did learn a lot about myself, and about our relationship and about family and about, who I am and who I want to be by writing. I mean, this really was a deep reflection on how we conduct ourselves as a family and how we live that out. And so, really revisiting that, it's kind of like a reminder or re-asking the questions. And I think luckily so far, I feel like the answers are holding up for me, right? It's a kind of a good reminder of what we've been through, and that as it continues to surface or as the next thing surfaces, we'll get through that as well. And especially, with my son has read the book. My daughter hasn't read it all the way through. She's not quite as much of a reader. But really, being able to think about that too, and just how important I think it is for my kids and for other people who might have similar experiences to just be able to look at the story from the outside and gain some insights that, again, I just think maybe we're not that good at talking about some of those most vulnerable and most important things. So even though it's hard, I think it's worthwhile. And it's been really rewarding to have those conversations, with readers, and hopefully open up those conversations, I guess.
Anyone else have a question or comment? An experience to share? Well, while you're thinking about it, we'll continue. You alluded to one of the complexities of these kind of deployment or deployed relationships is that the people, whether they're on the war side or the home side, they are developing coping patterns. Okay? Humans are creatures of habit, and because we all have limited processing power, so we have to figure out ways to put things in patterns and habit, and to put them down to a habit in order to do something. Even if we don't know we have a habit, those watching on the outside recognize we're doing things by habit. And they're not only habits by, function, there are also habits in our emotional swings during the day, what we have to accommodate for, who we have to accommodate with, finding all of those patterns. I mean, there's lots there, But now this person comes back and some changes have to occur to accommodate this person who is a part of our lives. We have been communicating with them, but now we have to accommodate them in a different way. I'm wondering if you can talk about kind of the before, during, and after of those kind of accommodations. What happened?
So as I mentioned, so Blake and I were married shortly before he was deployed, and so we had known each other all our lives, and we knew each other quite well, and we're good friends for many years before we actually started dating, and so we had I would say pretty good understanding of each other. We know our families well, so we knew these kind of rhythms of our lives. And I knew that my husband is quiet, introverted, and I was used to having to kind of draw things out, and that was okay. I mean, I think there's some complementary. I'm a little bit more extroverted, we complement each other. And so, having had that deep knowledge of each other, but yet we didn't have years of experience as a married couple living together. So, that's one of the challenges, like I said, that I think came from this deployment happening at the very beginning of our relationship. But because then, as soon as we were married, we had a few months where we were kind of in limbo, and I was on summer schedule, so I wasn't working all the time, and he knew he was being deployed, so he didn't get a full-time job. And so we kind of had this little roam around, couple months, had some fun, and spent time together before he was deployed. And so then when he was actually deployed and I moved into what would have been our first house together, and our son was born, you can imagine, obviously I had to take over a lot of responsibilities, right? I mean, I was the one here taking care of all of the family stuff. And so since our lives kind of developed so differently there, during the deployment changed things drastically, right? I kind of had that major role of paying bills and making all of the plans and doing all those kinds of things. And so after the deployment, there's always a little bit of communication to, I think from the family readiness, and I think it's important that we understand that idea. We don't want to push everything on someone who's had this military experience or any, experience like that all at once, how overwhelming that can be. And so I was always, I think, being very careful. Like, I didn't want to just say, here, now you got to take care of a kid 24 hours a day, and now you have to do this, and so there really is a lot of challenge to that, that adaptation. And I think I'm sure it's different for everyone, right? And it differs depending on the before and the during as well, right? For us, it just became a complete renegotiation, or kind of starting from scratch. But then also that was so complicated by the fact that, my husband was suffering from chronic pain and, wasn't necessarily functioning in the way that he is now that he has recovered, so there's just so many layers of complication to that negotiation that I don't know if I have any, simple answers to that, or if the progression seems like it has been continually changing.
Mhm. Well, the thing that I noticed in such kind of relationships is that it often is not the large things. It's all the little small things that they're kind of anchors in our daily lives, like where I put things so I know where I have them. And whether I put the forks up or put the forks down, washing the dishes, where does the toilet paper go in or out, and all those little things like that. One of them is not so bad, two or three, but in one's daily life, there's a whole stack of those babies, that.
And
that are out
maybe
there.
for us, when you say that, I feel like sometimes we delayed the negotiation of some of those smaller things because we had the huge ones at the beginning, right? Deployment and chronic pain, and I mean, these were major things. And so, so I think for us, some of that negotiation has happened more in the last 5 years, when it's like, okay, now we're over some of the big stuff, right? And then it's like, oh, so you do have a way that you like your forks. I didn't even know that, because we were so busy just trying to survive, right? So kind of like I said, it's interesting how many layers there are. But I do think, that I could see how much that has been different for us because of that situation, right? We had to face some of the big things first. And I think no matter when you do, we all have those challenges in our lives. And I think they ultimately bring us closer to the people that we love and trust, right? And we learn how to love and trust each other better. So hopefully that has given us the foundation to work through all the forks and the towels and the whatever.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about your inner conversation to allow that transition to happen, and I ask this with a particular kind of curiosity, because I deal with inmates who have been separated from their significant other for a long time. And one of the reasons that they end up going back is because they or their significant other have not been able to make the adjustments that you're talking about. That inner voice, they don't have a narrative that says, okay, it's okay if the forks are up or down, or I can give up that thing and I can try to do it a different way. Either they or their significant other don't have that conversation. They don't have a way to have that conversation within themselves. Can you talk a little bit about your inner conversation that allows you to say, oh, it's not that big of a deal, or it is that big of a deal. Here's how we can handle it.
Right.
What do you do?
To be honest, for me, that's a lot of what the writing process is the making sense of what is most important to me, or reflecting on, so I mean, there's a few moments in here where like I've written about an argument that we've had, or misunderstanding that we've had, but the writing process is really how I stop and look back and think, what really happened there? What was I actually thinking or feeling, or what's really at the heart of that? And similarly, I think because the writing process has really because it's my way of making sense of things encouraged me to ask questions that I think I otherwise wouldn't ask, right?
Have you asking a question of yourself or
Of my husband too.
of the
Both.
husband? Yeah, both.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one example is some conversations that we had, and I could pick up on this kind of crass, dismissive, harsh attitude that wasn't something that I didn't recognize from my husband. But there's a scene in the book where I was actually talking about a former student of mine that I learned had attempted suicide. And my husband's response was so harsh, and I was just really frustrated. But I think because I was writing this book to try to understand us and our communication and what was going on, when this conversation circled back to his military experience, then I could make this connection and go, oh, I see why he's, it's a coping mechanism, like you were talking about before, right? His way and the way of someone in the military who's dealing with death and those kinds of struggles it's very different from the coping mechanism that I, as a mother and a teacher, have, right, when I hear of a subject like that. And so it really is, for me, I think it's the writing process. It's just the process of questioning and trying to understand and make sense of things. That's why I write.
I'm going to open it up again before we go back to this conversation to our esteemed panel. Anyone else have any questions, insights, experiences that they can share on today's subject? Okay, we'll continue. If you have something that you want to say, don't wait till the last 5 minutes, because we'll be going around the bend by then. So Colby has a question, and his question is, what was the most challenging part for you in writing the book?
So that's another good question. I mean, there's a lot of challenges that come in the writing process, but one of the most difficult for me was actually figuring out how to end the book, because it's the story of our family and our experience that's continuing on, right? And so it was kind of like, well, how do I end this? There's no final chapter, thankfully, right? Like I said, that's my spoiler alert, is that we are together and we're living this life together. And so that was a real challenge, figure out, so where's a satisfying ending, that gives us some sense of, we need a narrative arc. We started here and where do we end up? That's a little bit different place. But that kind of came naturally when we moved to this home, and that's kind of the final chapter of the book. We're moving here because it's kind of like creating the beginning of the next phase or the next step in our lives, right? So luckily that kind of worked out, and I found an ending, because hopefully there's a lot more story to come.
That's right. I've noticed something about stories like this is the beginning of the story is never the real beginning of the story, and
Right.
The end of the story is never really the end of the story. It's when you stop writing, that's the end of the story.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Jennifer wants to know, what was your son's reaction to reading the book?
Mm-hmm. So my son actually started reading it when I was doing the final edits, and he had come into my room and was asking me for help with his homework, and then he was looking at my computer and he said, "Wait, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing some final edits on my book manuscript." And so then he was sitting there, and I thought he was finishing his homework beside me, but then he was like, "Wait, don't scroll so fast." And I said, "Oh." He was reading over my shoulder, and he said, "Well, I kind of remember that, but not all of it." Right. So that was the first time I got his reaction. And then he's like, "Well, when can I read the whole thing?" But that really is exactly what I would hope, for him and for my daughter. And again, for other people who, whether it's military experience or, have been in families where they've faced issues, with chronic pain or communication and separation or whatever it might be. but he looks at it and says, so I kind of remember some of these things, but this helps me to kind of fill in the blank and understand what was actually happening, right? And so so far we haven't had any of the really big deep conversations, but he has commented that it's kind of helped him to make sense of things. And and I think for my kids, when they were pretty young and their dad was suffering from chronic pain, and those are things that are hard for us as adults to talk about and understand. And so being able to look back on some of those experiences and think, okay, so I kind of remember that correctly, or I didn't get the whole story, I think is really important to making sense of, even just some of the way the communication felt in our family when they were young, and kind of intuitively knowing, I don't know, I think dad's not feeling well today, but not really knowing what that meant, right? So there is I think a lot of value in being able to have those conversations.
Right. Well, I want to go back to that, but I first want to give anyone else an opportunity if you have a question or.
Do
Jody?
you have a favorite scene to read or a favorite part of the, I don't know, I'm just curious, you have a favorite passage to read from your book?
Well, like I said, I kind of don't read the same one twice. I always, every time I present, want to read something different. I think that's part of just like, as a creative person, I get bored if I do the same thing over and over again. But yeah, so I think it's different every day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes, Todd.
Amber, I was just wondering, what kind of response have you got from like fellow veterans and families of veterans, particularly, of recent,
Yeah. One of the first readings that I did, I read an excerpt, and maybe this is partly an answer to your question too, Jody, because I have read this scene a few times. But when Blake came home from Iraq after George was born, and he had been home for his 2-week R&R, and then he was returning to Iraq. So we were in the Sioux Falls airport, and he has to hand his 2-month-old son back to me and take off, right, and go get on a plane and go back to war zone. That scene is actually one of the first ones I wrote about, because it was one of the things I was really trying to make sense of, like it was hard to watch that happen. But when I read that scene, after the reading, a young woman came up to me and said, when you read that, all of a sudden a light bulb went off. It made so much sense. She said, I saw my dad do that every time he left for guard drill. And she said, but I never had a name for it, or really even, she said, I just always thought he felt different. And then she said, when you read that, it made me realize, what was going on in his mind and in his body every time he had to leave. And so that right there was just like, that had a lot of impact on me, because that's really what this is about, is helping all of us understand ourselves and each other, right? And those little experiences. So I've had, comments like that, or people who could relate, especially a couple spouses who have been at readings, but also, a couple military veterans themselves who kind of say, man, I hadn't really thought about that side of it, and so it really is, I think, important for all of us to be able to share that insight, and just have more honest, deeper conversations about, it's okay that we are going through this. It's pretty natural, right, to feel that disconnect, to maybe struggle with communication, to have things that we don't want to talk. I mean, I think it's all okay, and that's why it was so important to me to share the story. It's just to kind of make it okay, I hope, to be where we're at. And also, I've noticed in talking with veterans how I think all of us, our perspective changes so much, right, throughout, like, some military veterans, I think, like my husband, especially when he first came home, had no intention of talking about anything, right? And maybe just can't bring themselves, and how much that changes over time. And I hope that that's evident too in the book. Like I said, I gained the courage to ask some questions, and we've had some conversations about things that I don't know if Blake ever would have opened up to me about. And so maybe even just that awareness, right, that it is a process and we're all at a different phase in kind of, the reflection on what this experience is for us, and that's okay too, right? We're not stuck in any one place, I guess.
What's the topic for your next book?
I just saw that pop up. I'm definitely playing around with a few different ideas. I've been writing some poetry, which has been fun. And from our conversation before this, and some of you, we've talked outside of this, I'm a sucker for a good sports story, and I have some of those stories that kind of want to come out. But then the most surprising is a little fictional character that has come to mind that keeps kind of wanting to show up. So I really have no idea. I have a few options and things that I'm exploring, but it feels fun to explore and create. And I guess we'll see which one takes precedence.
Anyone else? Anyone else? Well, I'll move on. One of the things that I should say is kind of like a turning point in a critical juncture is that people who go to war never really come back. Even if their bodies come back and they look the same, it's very unlikely that the person who left is the person who comes back. So the person that you married is not really the person that comes back, because those experiences gonna make you different. How does he cope with knowing that also you have changed, because your life also had some new things that you had to cope with, and as a result of coping with those things, especially on a daily basis, your view of like who you are and how you are invariably has to change.
Mm-hmm.
How does he cope with it? How do you cope with it, and how does the coping happen together?
It's a continuous process. And I think regardless of whether it's military experience or other experiences in our lives, I think that's very true for all of us, right? We probably are evolving into different people than we were, 15 years ago. My husband is a very thoughtful person. He does a lot of he likes to spend time outdoors, and I know, he processes things and he reflects and he thinks in that way. I process and explore and think through the creative process, and and then we do what we ultimately realize every time is that we make a good team when we bring that together, and we kind of can both encourage each other. But it's like, it continues to be challenging, right? There's always times when we're realizing that, oh, we've fallen back into that not communicating, like you do your thing and I do mine. It's an easy thing for us to fall back into, right? Because that's kind of how our relationship started in those first few years. And so we remember that what we're trying to hold on to is this thing that we have together, and that that means that we have to make a conscious effort to do that together, right? And find those connections. But like I said, I think even from the beginning of our relationship, we probably knew some of these things that challenge us the most are the things that complement each other the most too, right? And I don't know if I think that as all of us with our personalities and our strengths, I think our greatest strengths can be our greatest weaknesses if we don't understand how to use them to their best advantage, right? And so I think we're just constantly trying to find those ways to complement each other and to stay in it together, right? And find the ways that we can hold on to what's important to us. So
now comes, I think, kind of the big question. Military families have struggles and things that they have to do, but we don't live sort of like in a vacuum. We have friends, family, neighbors. What can we do to support military families in general in their struggle?
I think for me, like I said, I was very fortunate because I had so much family. I had people who were willing to and able to help me take care of my son if I needed, a little time to myself, or give me support, or even just spending time during a deployment. I think relationships and just reaching out and spending time is such an important thing, because I think, like I said, I felt almost defensive of, well, I don't want to ask for too much help, because then people will think that, Blake isn't doing his job, or, what I mean? Like, there's a lot of challenge too. And maybe that's a Midwestern thing. We don't like asking for help. But during a deployment, if, there's a military family that's separated due to deployment, just relationships and time together and, reaching out, I doubt most people are going to ask for it, right? But just inviting people over and, stopping by and creating that relationship, because, like you asked about early on, Lawrence, in such a thoughtful way. I mean, that loneliness, or, that disconnection, it's there, whether we feel abandoned and lonely, or just feel like we are alone, right? And so the connections, and, like we're talking about here, just making the connections, I think is really the most important thing. And I think with veterans, it's tricky because everyone's at their own point in their journey of what they want to talk about or feel comfortable talking about, or where they're at. But I don't think that asking questions is ever a bad thing, right? Starting conversations, it's just a way of starting a connection. So when the time is right, it's there, right?
I think the difficult part, at least for a person like myself, is you don't know what kind of help people need.
Right.
It's like you don't know if you just need to sort of come and sort of stand out on the lawn, or you don't know if you knock on the door and just say, how you doing, and or is there something that you need? And especially when you're around people who don't like to really say what they need, how do you read what they need and maybe just leave it on the porch,
Right. Yeah. But that's why I think, really the most important thing, and I guess I experienced this as an educator too, right? That if we make a connection, and just, make sure people know that we're interested, that we see them, that, then maybe it creates an opportunity for that conversation, or, to ask, so what is it specifically that I can do for you? But really underneath it all is just that connection, that genuine sense of, I see you as a person, I see what you're experiencing, and I want to do what I can. So yeah, that is a hard question to ask, or like you said, you can't read people's minds, but at least if we're in the same room, right? If we're connected somehow, we can get there.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm going to assume that there are some, let's say, formal / institutional help someplace.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about any of those in our last 30 seconds?
Well, with each deployment, I think there's a family readiness group, and there's support within that military unit. And they're usually sending out information all the time, and reaching out to the military veterans and their families. So I think it really depends on each unit, and just where you're located, and your local connections. that's a challenge with the National Guard in South Dakota because we're also spread out, right? So for example, for me, when Blake was deployed with Yankton and I was living in Bryant, I wasn't really right there, you know. And so, you know, but local churches and families are great supports as well. So
All right.
yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Amber, for joining us today. And thank all of you, our esteemed panel, for also joining us. Let other folks know about what we're doing here every Thursday at 10:30 to 11:30. And we want to invite you back next week, same time, same station. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.